Sound. It makes us laugh, cry, and sometimes really focus on what we, as an audience, are viewing. It begs the question, what if we didn't have sound in film? And how would audiences perceive films differently when stripped of the context that audio gives us? Sound definitely stirs up feelings, but deciding if a movie with sound is more emotional than one without is kind of up in the air. Film is truly subjective, and individual preference and opinions means that it's up to the filmmaker to sway their audience.
Sorry?
I said I love the Smiths.
And sometimes we don't even need sound. Naoko Yamada's 2016 A Silent Voice encapsulates this beautifully given the context of the film. Which is, a grade school student with a hearing impairment is bullied and transfers to another school. Years later, the former bully is tormented by his behaviour and sets out to make amends. Now we're on the topic of films with no sound, I think it's vital to note the introduction of sound to film in general. It's often misconceived that the first film with sound was The Jazz Singer, the 1927 musical romance film directed by Alan Crosland. However, the first film with sound was really 1894's The Dixon Experimental Sound Film, which implemented a device named the graphophone in order to record audio. This blog from Films Fatale claims that the Dixon Experimental Sound Film was actually, for a while, lost in time, as The Jazz Singer is much more recognised to be the first sound film. Where I believe this misconception breeds is that the two films are so different from each other technologically. The Dixon Experimental Sound Film had a distinct focus on just recording music, whereas The Jazz Singer pioneered the release of films that mixed music and dialogue to create one.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet.
And film skyrocketed in popularity from that point forward.
Music, sweet music.
What I really want to grasp is why sound plays such a large role, and why did popularity skyrocket, and what makes the audience come back for more. First, I think we should try and understand the science behind how emotions can be heightened when oral stimuli is added to visual stimuli, and we need to understand how audiences react.
Well, sometimes science is more art than science, Morty. A lot of people don't get that.
One source I found to be striking in the way it portrays audience reaction is Stephen Olate's thesis on the impact of emotional arousal in virtual learning environments, because it shows a correlation between stimuli just visually as compared to an audio-visual stimuli, suggesting through testing that the implementation of audio to any type of media does have an impact in at least a cognitive form in how an audience perceives what they are viewing. This part of the thesis explains that when a video game is given sound effects to go alongside gameplay, hormones are released by participants, which is evidential of a definite increase in overall audience reaction, and I wanted to test this theory in film. This is where we lead on to the research I personally conducted. A survey which shows clips from these 3 different romance films with
Why? My wife left me because I started drinking.
Scott Pilgrim? Hi, I was thinking about asking...
and without sound. Here I want to have a deep dive into our 3 examples and try to understand why each film uses sound in the way it does.
Groovy.
To understand the writer and director's intent, for that is what really sways how an audience is supposed to react. The results from this research were quite striking, displaying an overwhelming difference in how much audiences were engaged between seeing the clips with sound compared to without sound, and with a 76.7% for engagement in the clips with sound and 35% for the clips without sound. This simply proves that sound plays a huge role in how we as an audience keep our attention when viewing media. As well as this, one correlation that was discovered between each separate survey from my research was that music tends to play a larger role in how engaged the audience feels than the dialogue in most cases, stating it brings a sense of ease, or in Scott Pilgrim's case, it brings a sense of mysticism that is otherwise not there if the audio was standalone dialogue. When understanding why romance films use sound in the way they do, we need to analyse how the directors approach sound. Alfred Hitchcock, for one, played a huge role in how directors experimented with sound, with multiple of his films experimenting with recurring motifs that replace music in order to build tension in other ways. Despite his experimentation with sound, he still kept qualities of silent film in his work, even through to 1955's To Catch a Thief, where instead of sound he experiments with the conveying emotion and story by the expressed movements of his actors, all behind a glass door to simulate a sense of distance for the audience and thus creating impact in a rather creative way. When a film is fully fictional and artificial, unattached to our real world, there's something about the sound in WALL-E that seems equally as artificial, yet feels so impactful in the way it's used to convey emotion to the audience. Ben Burt, legendary sound designer and the sound designer for WALL-E, addresses in this interview with Soundworks Collection that when he is creating voices for these robots, he has to give them a sense of mortality and he has to use sound in a way that gives personality and character to lifeless beings. His impressive sound design, however, doesn't stop at WALL-E. Burt's ability to give inanimate robots and objects a sense of personality is also seen throughout his work on Star Wars, where he creates the character of R2-D2. The way in which he gives both WALL-E and R2-D2 personality is interesting in the sense that he uses his real voice to create these sounds they make when interacting with other characters in their respective films. This is important in respect to how emotions are intentionally conveyed by a sound designer and director to an audience, because this deliberate incorporation of personality effectively adds to the overall world building in these separate pieces of fiction, thus creating these creative techniques to engage the audience with a character that doesn't actually humanly exist. I believe that when it comes to the expression of emotion through sound in romance film, it's up to a mix of sound design, dialogue and music which creates this visceral, engaging overall experience for the viewer. As well as this, my primary research and wider knowledge is a deep dive into why an audience reacts the way they do in relation to romance film, as well as broader cinema, with the understanding being that cognitively and mentally, emotions are felt as a result of the context sound gives as an oral stimuli in cinema, and without it, modern romance film has much less context in regard to emotional cues and storytelling.